Before coffee, I said that if you review the international research about personal budgets, I have not yet come across any research which says that people's lives don't get better. But when it comes to cost,
things get a little bit more complicated. So, what do personal budgets cost? In fact, in England, when I was leading the process of change in England, that was the normal challenge, was how efficient are personal budgets? Won't personal budgets cost more? Was the normal challenge I faced day after day after day after day. And of course the actual answer to this is, it depends. How does that translate into Finnish? You know, yeah, right. So, you know, personal budgets at one level is just two English words, and there's two Finnish words, and I still find it quite hard to say the two Finnish words, so I'm not even going to try. Actually, what shapes costs and what happens to the economics depends on how you implement the idea. The good news is that it can be a very efficient way of organising things. But if you want to, you can organise a very inefficient version of personal budgets. These are questions of design. So I think that, you know, you've got to avoid, in the public policy discussion that you're having in Finland, falling into this trap of a simplistic approach which says, well, personal budgets are either impossible because they're going to be expensive, or dangerous because they're going to be cheap, or well, actually, we just don't know. Well, we do know quite a lot. I think there are four important things to remember. Maybe in practice, one of the most important is you've got to think about the money you are currently spending. Quite recently, the Dutch had an experiment in personal budgets which was reported to have failed. But it's interesting to read the actual research, which showed that, again, people's actual lives got better, and in fact, individual by individual, the funding was even efficient compared to the other way of delivering services in Holland. The failure was that the system was set up to only spend new money. So what they did was they said, we'll leave the existing system exactly as it is, and then we'll create a new personal budget system. So every time we spend money on a personal budget system, on a personal budget, it will be in addition to what we're currently doing. This is a kind of recipe for disaster in the reality of public policy. Even if you can argue that, well, look, this is really efficient, to politicians in a hurry, that will look inefficient, because suddenly the spending's gone up and they don't know why. So the most important thing to consider really is, how do you transform what you're currently spending money on? We had the same experience in England in the 1980s. The Thatcher government at the time was persuaded by disabled people to create something called the Independent Living Fund. And the government set aside a small amount of money for the Independent Living Fund. And they didn't believe people with disabilities wanted independent living. And what happened was actually an enormous number of people came and asked for that funding, so that the funding shot up, and the government then said, we can't afford it. And so they then changed the system and added in lots of bureaucracy to control it. And this is always what happens when you start kind of creating new funding pots. You see it again and again and again. And it may not be fair that they did that, but that's what happens. What nobody did back in the 1980s is say, we're already spending money on services for people with disabilities badly. Let's change how we're spending the money. And that is surely where we should start. And I think in practice, in Finland, as in England, as in across the welfare states around the world now, if your intention is only to bring about good things by spending new money, you'll be in trouble, because there's very little new money around. You've got to be thinking about transforming the old money. The second big problem, I think, is that if you create systems that where you try and centralise too much, you'll often get in problems. The more you move budgets, I mean, if you move budgets to individuals, they spend them wisely. But also if you move budgets to communities, they're more likely to spend them wisely than cities, who are more likely to spend it wisely than countries. So in a way, you want a system where you keep pushing money down, not just to individuals, but to communities, where people can actually use a little bit more common sense and keep things under control. Again, it's quite attractive in theory to have central government in control of all the funding, because of course central government has all the money. The problem is that central government is also likely to quickly overspend, because it has very poor control generally, and when it does overspend, it's likely to use bureaucracy to ration the services. The third thing you need to think about is how the system is managed, how closed or open the system is, I think, is the way I think about it. It's quite common in personal budgeting systems around the world for people to say that, well, we need a whole new system now of professionals to manage the planning, to manage the administration of the budget before it even gets to the person. And quite often what you get is a little specialised industry of people who say, well, our job is to help people with disabilities, or help people with learning disabilities, or help families, or help people with mental health problems. And often these organisations and professionals and NGOs are full of good people. But it's a little bit crazy to narrow everything down like that. There's no evidence that we need to do that. What we did in England was we did the opposite. We really said, well, look, if you and your social worker can work this out without any additional assistance, then that's great. If you want to go to peer supporters to sort this out, then that's great. If you want to go to a service provider and sort this out, that's great. And the great thing about having an open approach is you don't create little mini monopolies that drive up the cost and create inefficiencies. The fourth thing you really need to think about, it's the issue that comes up again and again in the international literature, is the flexibility of the personal budget. If you say, as some people want to, you can have a personal budget, but you can only really spend it on the kind of things we already do, which is really how vouchers tend to work, then really you will minimise the kind of efficiencies that you'll find, because most of the really interesting things aren't already available. Does that make sense? That the interesting things and the efficient things are the things people create together in community. So if you start to say people can only spend their money on things that already exist, you've really trapped the system in its old economics. So you need to start opening your eyes to what's possible in the wider community, and you need to make money flexible, super flexible. This is, these are just, so no one of these figures should be taken as a reliable figure for personal budgets, because you remember what I said, it depends. But it just gives you a taste of, these are all reports where people's outcomes improved and costs went down. So the actual efficiency improvement, if you're going to talk in those, using that kind of language, is even bigger than the financial change, because actually it's not the same and costs go down, it's better and costs go down. And to be quite frank, the reason why we've seen so much change in England is because politicians found it very difficult to resist argument that showed big quality improvements and cost reductions. in the example I gave you earlier, this is what people said in the context of an organisation that faced a 30% cut in funding, introduced over 5 years, not all at once, and yet people said people's lives have improved or haven't got worse. This is not an argument for cutting funding, by the way. Yeah, but you can't, if you can see ways of improving how money is being used, surely we should take them. We shouldn't defend funding by spending it badly. So, the funny thing is, though, that the reason why personal budgets are efficient is strangely because money is not the most important thing in life. And this comes through a lot in the stories and examples. One of my friends, Pippa Murray, came up with this model. She herself is a mother who had a child with disabilities who sadly died, Kim. And then she works now with other families with children with disabilities. And she asked families, so this wasn't from theory, this was talking to families about what made families stronger, what was the true wealth of the family. And families said, so this was quite humbling for me, they said the personal budget is not the most important thing. The money is good, but really the most important things that keep us strong are relationships with other people, our gifts, and the community that we can become part of. And ultimately, they kind of agreed, it's even beyond that, it was almost their attitude or the spirit with which you coped with problems. Of course, the budget helps because it helps improve the resources that are available to people. And because you've improved those resources, you can, if you've got freedom, you can also make things better in other ways. So I'm going to give you just a simple example from an example of respite services. So Mary and Doreen are mother and daughter, and Doreen used to go for 2 weeks a year to the residential respite service in part of Scotland. The total cost of that service for a year, so it's just 2 weeks, you can work out the weekly cost or the daily cost, but it's for a whole year it was £3,000. So it's a tiny service, and now Mary felt she needed that Doreen go to the service because she needed a break. Otherwise she was Doreen's main carer. Doreen hated the service. She hated going to respite. She hated things like the fact that she had to have a name sewn on the back of her clothes because when they all went in the wash, things got lost. So she felt that it was disrespectful, the whole process. She didn't like it at all. So Mary, although she wasn't desperate for a personal budget, but she was part of a little group that we began to explore personal budgeting in a municipality close to Glasgow. Mary said, "Okay, well I'll try this out." But she was quite nervous. She didn't feel strong, confident, and she wasn't, coming up with brilliant plans. In fact, she said to my friend Suzanne, who was planning with Mary, or helping Mary, "I really don't know what to do with £3,000. And so Suzanne, who I think is a little bit of a genius, I really like her. She didn't do what probably I would have done, not being so clever. I might have sat down with Mary and come up with plans. Yes, natural thing to do. But Suzanne said, "Well, let's send a little postcard to all your friends and family and invite them round for tea at your house." And Mary goes, "I don't think anybody will come." And Suzanne says, "Well, let's try it. You've got nothing to lose." So they send the cards out, and then a few weeks later, there's a meeting in Mary and Doreen's house. And Suzanne tells me the house was overflowing with people. And what people said was, We've just been waiting for you to ask. I think Scots, English, Finns, we're not very good at asking. So maybe we're going to have to carry that burden. But, and then what happened was that actually the group solved the problem of how to spend the £3,000. But they didn't just solve the problem by working out what to spend it on, they got involved. So I always remember that Doreen really liked the Irish pop singer called Daniel O'Donnell. Has anybody heard of? I don't see any reason why you shouldn't do it. Dreadful. But anyway, Doreen really liked Daniel O'Donnell. And so did Mary didn't. Mary didn't want to go to a pop concert with Daniel O'Donnell, but some other members of Mary and Doreen's family also liked Daniel O'Donnell. So what they organised was a trip with Doreen and a friend to go to see Daniel O'Donnell in Ireland. They stayed there for several days. They managed that with a fraction of the money that was being spent on residential respite. And in fact, very quickly, they realised that that money could be used in all sorts of creative ways if they all got involved. And in fact, Mary in the end said, well, actually I don't need respite from Doreen anymore because life is much better and we've got many more things we can do together and friends and family get involved and we don't need that. And the great thing, and this is what Mary said, is it's great because Doreen doesn't cry anymore. She doesn't cry anymore having to go to residential respite. And I think that's a powerful story for lots of reasons, not just because how terrible is it that we spend money on social services that make people cry. I mean, that's pretty shameful, isn't it? That's government money wasted. I don't think it is government money, by the way. I think it's our money, but anyway, that's a different discussion. But also see that, can you see that was an example of real wealth? What a lot of what's going on there is that people are using the community, they're using the things that are important to them, they're using their relationships. The money helped. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the money's not important, but what really helped was the money was flexible. And you see, and so people could connect all those things together. So this is my, and this was actually pointed out to me by John O'Brien. I hadn't read this book, but he pointed out that this, actually what's going on in the difference between the old system and personal budgets is the difference between what's called push economics and pull economics. So in push economics, what we do is we take money and we spend it on things and hope that it has a good effect. Does that make sense? So we spend it on a day centre, and then that we hope that the people who have to go to the day centre get a good experience. And some people get an okay experience, some people get a bad experience, but it's all a matter of luck, really, because the money has been spent already. Pull economics says, actually, allow people control, and they will pull in the different things that they need to combine to create good solutions. So this is my understanding of what's going on. And I think it's very important because there is one of the dangerous mistakes you can make in Finland, and certainly we've seen this mistake being made in England, and I see it being made by friends in Australia at the moment, is to think that this is all about markets, yeah? Liberal economics, price, supply and demand. Actually, there's no evidence that this has got anything to do with markets. In fact, funnily enough, as far as I can tell, people get better outcomes when there are no real services to choose from. Because they have to create better, more personal solutions. And that might be heresy, but that is, as far as I can see, what the evidence suggests. It's not that people go shopping for services, and the more that we push services at people and think that this is about shopping for services, the more we'll get this wrong, I think. So really what we're doing is we're stopping doing this, aren't we? We're stopping spending people's money for them. This money should be the person's entitlement, but we spend it for them, and we spend it for them on, you know, again, for people with learning disabilities, often it's this rather sad combination of day centres, special transport, and residential care home. It's not a smart way of spending millions of people's euros, and especially when that money really should belong to the person. And one of the fundamental things here, I think, is that we don't think about needs in the right way. So I think in public policy, in healthcare, in good places like the Finnish Institute, it's quite common to talk about needs, meeting needs, the efficiency of meeting needs. But actually, spending money on services doesn't help people meet their needs. Actually, many needs, many fundamental needs, aren't even things that you can do for me. Many of my needs are only things that I, or people that love me, can meet together. And the most famous model of needs analysis is the Maslow hierarchy, yes? I imagine anybody here who's done social policy or health and social care will come across Maslow's hierarchy. This is my take on Maslow's hierarchy. I kind of think Maslow's hierarchy is right and wrong. Right and dangerous, really. What Maslow's hierarchy is, I think, correct about is, and it's not uninteresting, that, you know, we try and protect ourselves from the elements before we go to classical music concerts, yes, and so forth. There are some things we'll do first. I think what's dangerous is the notion that needs can be met, and that these are just by just anybody. That your need to flourish can be met by me in some way. I can design a service to help you meet your needs. This whole way of talking and thinking is dangerous. And you can see it really if you go up Maslow's hierarchy. Not just the top level of self-realization, but things like sociability. How can I form friendship? How can you form friendships for me? Doesn't make sense, does it? You can't meet my need for friendships, for relationships, for love. Only I can. I'm not saying you might not be able to help. I mean, I'm a great believer in helping, but you're not meeting my needs. You might be facilitating me to meet my needs. So we have to really move to, I think, a model which starts with rights, not needs. And I think although we talk about rights a lot, we talk about the UN Convention, we say we think these things are important, actually mostly the way public policy and the post-war welfare state works is to think that powerful, intelligent people with money can sort out people's needs for them. And in a lot of things that happen in government and in society, I think we're under this illusion that the powerful can sort everything out for us, and they can't. What we need are good rights and good systems that make those rights real. But we don't need all our problems to be solved for us. Now, okay, so my time is about it. This may not work. This is the 5th seminar, and what I've discovered is Finns don't, and I think there's lots of reasons. Partly you've had to listen to me in English, so it's quite hard to then ask me questions either in English or Finnish. Partly I think you don't like being rude, even if you think that I'm talking a load of rubbish. You're not going to tell me I'm talking a load of rubbish because you're very polite people. Partly I think you don't ask lots of questions and you don't do that. So, but what I'd like you to do just for a minute or so is talk to the people next to you, and just about what I was saying before coffee or what I said after coffee, and then maybe some of you might have a few questions. So if you don't have questions, I've still got lots of slides, so I will carry on. But it's just an opportunity to maybe just some of the things that might have been raised by what I've said. So 2 minutes to talk, and then a few minutes of questions if you feel up to it. I'm going to try this. So I've never seen one of these before, but I think this is now the modern microphone. And the great thing about it is you can throw it to people. I don't know, it depends on people's catching skills, doesn't it? Anyway, so has anybody got a question? Yes.
So this works? Yes, okay. So I'm Linda Laatikainen from the Rinnekoti Foundation, and what I was interested in is that at the moment in Finland all our examples are pretty much from the daily services that people get outside of their home. And in fact, what we're typically seeing abroad, and especially in the US where I've also been working on these kinds of models, is that they're trying to go towards global capitation, so that it would be a broader reach than just the päivätoiminta or työtoiminta. And in fact, you would put all the money together into the henkilökohtainen budjetti that you would have in the työ- and päivätoiminta, but also in your healthcare system and in your living. So what's your take on a broader spectrum? The reason I'm obviously interested is because I come from an organization that's 90 years old, and our history is global capitation. We typically used to just take one sum, and then we managed all the risks that could be involved with a severely disabled person needing very unusual services, and we could manage that. That was our expertise. And now with the new systems, it's starting to be broken apart, and we're starting to lose some of the benefits that were within the old global capitation system.
Saman suomeksi.
There was a request to translate it into Finnish.
Okay,
so,
go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Eli Linda Laatikainen Rinnekotisäätiöstä, ja kyselin tästä rahoitusmallista, että tällä hetkellä henkilökohtaisessa budjetoinnissa puhumme Suomessa erittäin paljon päivä- ja työtoiminnasta, kun taas itse asiassa näissä kansainvälisissä malleissa puhutaan laajemmin erityisesti vaikeavammaisten kohdalla niin tästä rahoitusmallista, ja ne suurimmat hyödyt ja säästöt tulee, kun se koko rahasumma, mitä elämässä käytetään, pistetään samaan pottiin, eikä sitä ruvetaan erottelemaan. Ja meillä tietenkin on erityinen kiinnostus tätä asiaa kohtaan, koska meidän säätiössä on totuttu ottamaan vain se yksi koko rahasumma, ja sillä on annettu kaikki palvelut, lääkäripalvelut ja asumiset ja työ- ja päivätoiminnat ja muut, ja silloin ollaan saatu niitä mahdollisia hyötyjä aikaiseksi, kun se koko riski on sitten ollut meillä siinä yhdessä summassa, mutta tälle tasolle ei olla vielä Suomen keskusteluissa edes tänäkään päivänä päästy. Me yleensä keskustelemme vain sitä pienestä osiosta. Ja lounasaikaankin meillä oli mielenkiintoinen keskustelu tuossa, jossa puhuimme siitä, että esimerkiksi jos nykyään asumispalvelua ostetaan ympärivuorokautista, niin siihen kuuluu vain ne työntekijät, jotka ovat siinä yksikössä, yksikkökohtaiset työntekijät. Silloin ei yleensä ole mahdollista kilpailutusten puitteissa sanoa, että asiakas haluaa nyt lähteä vaikka ostoksille selloon, ellei ole erikseen sovittu, että siinä kilpailutuksessa on sekä tämä yksikkökohtainen henkilöstö että myös henkilökohtaisia avustajia. Joten me olemme tällä hetkellä vielä turhaan, kenties ainakin kansainvälisiin vertailuihin nähden, niin fragmentoituneita tässä rahoitusmallissamme.
Okay. So I think there's a lot going on in that question. So let me see what anything sensible I can say. But part of what you're asking about, you're calling it global capitation. So I think of that as kind of risk management. So who is responsible for the variation of needs that might occur? And you're quite right that you can organise for that in lots of different levels, can't you? And I think what I was arguing is that at some level it's quite good to, if you put that, if we were to take all the social care spending and spread it individual by individual, it'd be a disaster, because actually that's the point, isn't it? That some people's needs are this big and some people's needs are that big. So we pool the risk, yes? And in general terms, whether it's organised through the state or through an NGO or community organisation, for me isn't the big issue. It is an important and interesting issue, actually, but it's not really the one you want to talk about, and it's a different issue. I think there is a good case for, if you like, subcontracting some of the risk down closer to community. So that's the first thing I'd say. I think and I think it is, if you draw it all up into the most central, because that's how the welfare state at some level is, it pools all the risk right at the top, but then it always needs to kind of break it up. I mean, I think the idea of integration generally is always a little bit balmy. So it was balmy translated to Finnish. It's always a little bit strange because anything you make big, you then have to break down to manage it. Do you know what I mean? So it's a complicated issue, but I suppose I think that if you're saying, is there a role for community or other organisations to share and spread risk, then that seems to me reasonable. Yes, is the answer to that. I think the other thing that was in your question is about two things that I think I do have a different view on. Health and social care. I actually don't think health and social care do go very well together, although I think bits of healthcare belong in social. So this is a complicated. So I suppose I would make a big distinction between community services, like the classic example is ambulance, where I want somebody to organise a good ambulance service. I don't want to be involved in the organisation of the ambulance service. I just want a good ambulance service in case I fall over, yes, and break my leg or have a heart attack, yes. So that seems to me that's definitely community. And then there's a number of things that, like maybe I need a heart operation after I've had a heart attack and now I need a heart operation. Well, I don't want to get involved in the heart operation. I want good quality heart surgery. I might want a bit of choice about that, but really I expect that system to be sorted out by a good healthcare system, yes? And the amount of choice I want is pretty minimal. I certainly don't want to get involved in the surgery at all. You know, I think that's somebody else's business. And there's no benefit to me about knowing what the funding is or anything like that, is there? It doesn't matter. It's probably best, I don't know. It's probably best at some level just dealt with behind the scenes. But these are the things that about my day-to-day life. These are the things that we could call social care, social services, help at home, help at work, help to be part of the community. These are the things we're talking about here. Now in this case, then I might want you to have pooled the risk, but I don't want you to tell me how my life should be. Right? So what I want from your service, where you've pooled the risk, is a fair budget for me to control. Does that make sense? That's how I approach it. And I think that we're still a bit muddled. I think that there is a really interesting distinction, and it isn't between health and social. Health and social is a slightly confused concept, I think. It's going to fall apart. The really interesting distinction is between those things where I might want choice, but I don't need any control, and those things I really need control over because it's about the detail of my life. And almost all social services will fall on this side, but actually so will mental health services, so will services for people with chronic conditions, long-term nursing, because it's about your life. It isn't about a health intervention. It isn't about an operation. Does that make sense? Have I kind of answered some of your question? Yes, okay, good. It was a good question. You packed a lot in. Okay, does anybody, yes?
Helen out here from this institution. Could you describe the process where you define the amount for the personal budget? And what happens if the worker and the client have differing views? Like, who solves the conflict then?
Yes, okay. Well, the first thing to say is, I've been involved, I've probably come up with about 5 different ways of answering the first question, and I'm not sure any of them are that brilliant, and I know of many other ways. There is no one answer to that question. One of the things a decent system needs to do is have a process or a system for answering that question. In a way, well, you have one at the moment for personal assistance, and I don't know how exactly it works in Finland, but in England it always kind of roughly worked by, well, I'm going to pick on Arnie. So I'm the social worker, I will come along, I will plan with Arnie what he needs, I will cost it up according to a set of formulae that Arnie can't really control, and I can't control, that have normally been set for me. This is the hourly rate or what have you. And then we have a care plan. Now, in England, typically, what has tended to happen is Arnie then has to get the service that way. And actually, one of the things that personal budgets did is it started to change the way personal assistance worked, because people then got the right to change how their budget was used. So even people with direct payments in the English system found that there were improvements, because actually they no longer had to spend the money that way. So, but you could consider that a resource allocation system. Yes, you could consider that a process for developing a budget, which is basically care planning. I developed a system slightly different to that, which was to say, well, what are we currently spending on people? Yeah, so actually, in any system, there tended to be a series of levels. In fact, I have a picture somewhere, so I'll make my hand waving, reduce my level for hand waving. I'll just have to flip down here somewhere. It's way down here. Nobody's ever asked this question in the seminar before, so it's a nice technical one. In practice, in most systems, because most systems are pretty institutional, how money is spent is quite clunky. Yeah? So you have basically a lot of people getting some low level of package, and then slightly fewer people getting a bit more, and fewer. So you have that, yes, that kind of set of columns going up somewhat exponentially, but obviously it doesn't go up to infinity. Actually, at its simplest, I've come up with different processes, but I ended up going all the way back to what I started with back in 20 years ago, which my view would be most social workers, once they've met Arnie and they know what the typical patches are, can work it out in about 5 minutes. I know that's heresy, but that's what I think. I've worked with social workers, I've done it myself. I think it's quite useful, because then you cut out the care planning. The problem with the care planning process is that, in a way, I'm dictating to Arnie how he has to present his needs to me. I'm determining the solution according to a template in my head, and then we're costing that up, and then he's got to go away and think, now I've got that amount of money, but what if I wanted to spend it differently? Whereas if you actually go straight to, well, this is your budget, then you can have a conversation, well, if we had, a bit like Mary and Doreen, if we have this amount of money, what might you want to do? So, I mean, in a way, and there's a whole range. So I started with two extremes, really. So you can have just care planning for somebody using formulae. Care planning is not free, in a sense. There's a whole series of constraints behind the scenes, because nobody allows you to pay your workers €100 an hour, do they? So it'll work to some formula. So that's one model, to something like this. And then you can build things in between that. We did things where I might have gone and asked Arnie some questions, got some kind of scoring, said, oh, well, that relates to somebody who needs about that much. So a lot of this depends on this question, actually the earlier question, about where the risk is managed. The more the risk is managed close to the community, the more common sense you can apply. The more risk is managed up above, the more bureaucracy you need to apply. Because if you're managing a kind of modest level of risk over a community where the budget is reasonably well known, you can kind of adjust intuitively. So if somebody has a high level package, you know that other people can't all have high level packages, because it would all become too expensive. So that's a complicated question. You want to ask a follow-up? Yeah, go on.
But what happens in a conflict situation
yes.
where the worker thinks that the 5,000 is enough and the client says that I think I deserve 10,000? So who solves the problem then?
Yeah, you need a process. You need a panel. Yeah, just like you would. But that's true now, isn't it? If presumably the social worker, if Arnie doesn't like my assessment, Arnie has some recourse to go somewhere else. So you just design that into the process. It's not that bit is kind of easy. And the good news is that actually, these kind of processes tend to create more harmony. Most people work to the budget. A few people come back and say the budget you've set was too much, and a few people say it was too little, and the variation is quite modest. And interestingly, quite often more people say it was too much than it was too little. So which we have seen in other research literature, which is that people with disabilities often assess their needs more accurately or lower than professionals. Because professionals are often nervous of making mistakes, so they might tend to over-assess, I think, as a rough rule. So paradoxically, I think by being clear and upfront, you drive trust into the process, though. Yeah, because if you say, like, my job, I think Arnie, you're a kind of middle. You know, compared to other people I know, I think, and Arnie, you know, unless he's got lots of reasons to think you're going to lie to him, he'll take your word, and then you work around developing solutions to that in that way. So again, I think trust is quite an important ingredient to this. Yeah. Thank you.
I don't know, I'm Eija Vihantovaro from Helsingin Diakonia-opisto. I don't know if I have any questions, but I think what we need is a change of attitude, how we form our services. Because if you have to take the client as the citizenship, think about the personal rights, what we want, how we have to change the way we produce our services. And that makes the organizations, bigger organizations like Rinnekoti and otherwise, they have to compete, they have to change their way to, they have to adapt this new model, and the society and
Yes.
has to think different ways of services they have been in before. And I think we as, I myself am a teacher, but I think it makes it, I have to take different attitude myself too with the students. They have to and try to see different ways the things we have used to come, but the services come from institutional way, and now we have to think individual way. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think you get the picture.
Yes. No.
Yeah.
I think this
I don't think we need more money, but we need different ways of organizing the services, and different kind of attitude. It's not usually. It's always not money. It's how we take towards things ourselves. Yeah.
I think that's true, and I think that, and again, the good news is that, say for social workers as a profession and as a role, this can be very, very positive. It can almost be liberating. It can almost be, I think a lot of social workers, I don't know about Finland, but in England, it feels like your training talks about values, about human rights. You might talk about flexibility and personalisation, but you go into a system where none of those things are part of the system. And so you suffer this painful stretch, really, and it becomes a bit dispiriting. And I think we've had a lot of feedback that social workers feel like they can be social workers for real. And I think that's a good sign. I think that also for people organising services, this can also be a liberation. It can be a liberation at lots of levels, but at a very kind of system level, one of the big liberations is to discover that it's actually quite nice to feel that the people you support are people who've chosen your support and you're working in partnership with them. And that isn't really normally the case, because normally there might be a little bit of choice in there, but normally really people have to put up with your services and then they kind of become your community. But when people know that they choose you, and if they don't like you can opt out and they can take their budget with them, then I think that's actually better for service providers, because it's more dignified and adult for both parties. And it opens up creativity. So this becomes, though, the big challenge, because we all hate change. Even if what seems like change can look good on a Monday, it can feel scary on a Tuesday, and you're worrying about your salary on a Wednesday. Yes, so all of those processes are very difficult for professionals to get through. And in introducing personal budgets, again, the danger is that people tend to think it's just like a system change. You press a button, everything's going to change. No, if Finland tomorrow changed the whole funding system over to personal budgets for social care, well, nothing's changed. I mean, everything could change, but nothing has changed. All the change has to come from us, whether we are people with disabilities, whether we are families, whether we are professionals. We still have to go through the process of thinking, well, how are we going to do something different? So a personal budget is a tool. I don't know about you. I'm terrible at DIY, crafts. I think Finns are probably really good at this. Somebody told me a lot of you are really good engineers, and see mending saunas, and you're really good at these things. But I'm terrible, and I compensate for being terrible at DIY. When I go to the DIY store to buy a hammer, I always buy an unnecessarily expensive hammer. Yes, because I think it's just like I'm making up for the fact that I know when I get back I'll just be no good with this at all. And then I buy a hammer, and it normally just sits in my toolbox in the garage. Yes, and tools are like that. It's not having a tool; it's knowing how to use the tool that's the key, isn't it? And yes, very good point. All right, question over here, and then I'll talk on a wee bit more.
Hi, I'm Sami. I'm a student in Helsinki Diagnostisopisto. Like you said, if tomorrow personal budgets come to Finland, it's not overnight. It's just a tool to help us think. Because my job as a practical nurse, my job is to make person's life better. Personal budgeting is a tool. It's like you said, it's not comes overnight. But let's have this play of like it happens overnight. Because like then you have to think your way of doing stuff. Do I want to do this what I do daily tomorrow?
Yes.
Do I want to change it? But as I'm pretty sure, like I can tell, I've been studying like in these different places. Like I can tell at least like there's in this work disabled people come to work for a day, and I can tell for those 22 people at least 5 could go immediately off. But how long would you see? Have you like had this play thoughts that how long would it take to the whole government to take the process of doing stuff?
So I mentioned the Independent Living Fund. That's the first little version of personal budgets we had in England, and that was, I think, 1988. And then we had direct, and so that's tiny, and then we had a different version of that, and then we had, I'm going to forget something else, like direct payments, and that went up a bit, and then we've had personal budgets, and that's like half the whole system. And so that's 1988 to 2016, so that's not that long. But most of that was the last 10 years. In a way, I think that I'm not sure that there's anything I can say that's very helpful about timing, because it's usually such a mess. Every country has done it in a kind of messy way, and very few countries have really quite gone as far as England. So it's interesting at the moment, Australia is planning a complete transformation, and it's introducing extra funding, and it's got its own, it's actually got a very, the lady who was asking about, what's the lady who's asking about calculations gone? Okay, but Australia has a really interesting but quite complicated and hard to explain insurance-based model for calculating budgets. So, and they're spending millions of dollars in computer systems to do that. So we'll see how that actually works out. But it's not going to happen a long time, that quickly, I think. I think the other thing that's really important is always remember the normal curve. Yes. So that I think in practice, I think I've probably got this slide somewhere, I may have. In practice, what you find is that, no I don't, but I have got it somewhere else. No, I won't distract myself finding exactly the right slide. In practice, what you find is that there are usually, exactly as you said, a small number of people who are desperate for change. And it doesn't take very much. And there are usually a small number of people who aren't desperate for change, but are usually really unhappy and kind of stuck. And usually there's quite a lot of people in the middle who might be a bit unhappy, but generally aren't that unhappy. Does that make sense? Yeah? I think if you're in your position, what you've got to do is pay a lot of attention to those two groups. The first group will lead the way, and you learn from them. It's not you innovating, they innovate. And what you can do is help communicate to others what they've achieved. The most powerful way of doing that is just keeping people to talk to each other. So making sure that there are forms of peer support so people can communicate with each other. But social workers and nurses also have a very important role, particularly for the people who may be really stuck and things are really going badly. And one of the great things about personal budgets is, in a sense, you don't need to do so much for the folk where either they're going to sort things out or things are okay. In a way, it takes the pressure off, but it also demands that you really give attention to the people where it's not working, and it gives you the tool to do something much, much better. So generally for professionals in a kind of social work type role or nursing type role, this is an opportunity to use your energy differently. Yeah? And to focus, for some people, facilitate, for other people, really go in and help. Does that make sense? And I think that we've tended to not always support that properly. We've often asked professionals to work in almost standardised ways. Like, that's the process and you treat everybody the same. But you almost need to start developing a different kind of approach for different people in different situations. Right, I'm going to try and squeeze in, I'm just going to squeeze in like 2 or 3 quick thoughts before past. Is that all right? And then
you can take some more time.
Well, we'll see how kind of. This slide here just represents that one of the things you'll need to do if you have a system of personal budgets is some rules for how personal budgets get managed. What we had in England was actually in 1996. We had a system called direct payments, which gave people with disabilities the right to take their money out of social care and manage it themselves. But interestingly, families were excluded from that legislation. So families weren't allowed to do that for their son or daughter with learning disabilities, or for their mother with dementia, or so the legislation was quite restrictive. And so one of the things we were able to do was change the rules to enable families also to act as people's representatives when that was appropriate. The other thing that we did with personal budgets is we said, well, we need, actually social workers themselves can use personal budgets, and the personal budget can be used flexibly. The person can still spend their money on existing public services. They don't need to, as it were, take all their money out of the system if they don't want to. And the other thing that we did, and I think is really important, and this is perhaps the thing I wanted to just encourage you to think about, is we also encourage people to think of other ways of managing budgets. So some peer support groups are good at doing this. Centres for Independent Living are good at doing this. Some community organisations or brokerage organisations can be set up to help people manage their budgets. And also, some service providers, that can become the way in which they work. One of the things that and I'm sorry this isn't translated into Finnish yet, but one of the things that I was involved in developing 20 years ago was this notion of an individual service fund, which was really saying your personal budget is inside an organisation and it's protected, it's for you. And if you want to take it somewhere else, you can do. But inside the organisation can treat it differently. It treats it as your money. And yes, there's a management fee because the organisation is managing it and it may be providing services, but actually it's still your money inside the organisation. I think this is a very useful model because not everybody wants to take everybody I think wants flexibility. Everybody wants this to work well and fit around them. But not everybody wants to become an employer. Not everybody wants to manage accounts. Not everybody wants to be preparing papers for the social workers about how it all works. So it's quite good to be able to say, I'm actually quite happy to pay a little bit for somebody else to organise that, as long as I can choose, and as long as I've got the right to take my money somewhere else. Actually this model, we developed it initially with this family, and this goes back 20 years. And this is the first time using an individual service fund. Maybe I'll just tell the story and then we'll just open it up to questions again. But in this case, this family had 2 boys with learning disabilities, but also a horrible disease called mucopolysaccharidosis. I don't know if any MPS. So it's not a good thing because it means you die early, and it's a degenerative disease, and it damages your brain function, and it also changes your behaviour. So it's a pretty horrible thing to have. And family had 2 boys with this, and they were living, when I met them, the family were living in a 2-bedroom flat in Glasgow. So there were 5 people in the family and 2 bedrooms and 2 boys in their late teenage years with this complex condition. And in fact, when I met them, the 2 boys were now in an institution because the family couldn't cope any longer. And so actually it took me about one of my experiences a lot of the time is that systems are often very negative about families, and it took me about 2 months to get to speak to the family. And when I managed to speak to the family, it was clear that the family really loved their boys, but that they were struggling to cope in this environment. No support and terrible physical environment. Meanwhile, the boys were in an institution, and even though many of the professionals were still rather negative about the family, all the professionals recognised that actually the family were the place where the boys needed to be. The service for the boys cost £90,000 a year, so that's 120,000 euros. I went and said, because remember, I mean, maybe I should have asked for £90,000, but what I was asking the authorities to do was nobody had ever done before. So I said, give me £30,000 for each boy. We will manage that money flexibly. We will spend part of that money on helping the whole family move house. So the family moved from a 2-bedroom house to a 5-bedroom house, so that they had a room for each boy. The house was accessible, and we used some of the money for that purpose. The family didn't like getting domiciliary care from social work. They wanted people that they trusted and knew, so they employed first of all they employed their uncle, and everybody said, well, that's terrible because they might fall out with the uncle. Wouldn't that be dreadful? Well, the thing was, 2 years later they did fall out with the uncle, and then they employed the aunt. Is it so dreadful? Families fall out, every family's a bit crazy, it doesn't really matter, and they made it up with the uncle. That doesn't make any difference, this worked for the family. And the third thing we did was we replaced, the boys had one service that they were getting before that they went to the institution, which was residential respite, which cost £1,000 a week, and they got 2 weeks each, 4 weeks. And I always have to say this because I think this is so shocking and yet so normal. The residential respite service said that they wouldn't take both boys at the same time because they were too challenging. You just think about that for a moment. They charge £1,000 a week. The family live with the boys. So they never get respite from the respite service because they're always supporting one of the boys. And But actually, for the family, that was still better than nothing. So many people will put up with what looks very poor to maybe our eyes, but it's better than nothing. But when we had the £4,000, we said, well, what would you like to do with that? So what we did was the family rented a large caravan by the sea, which is where a lot of people in Glasgow go for their holidays, and they used that as a place that the boys could go, or the family could go without the boys, or one parent could take one of the boys. It opened up all sorts of options, and that cost the same as the 2 weeks of residential respite where both boys couldn't go at the same time. And I think that story for me is quite a good example of, you know, the creativity that is released by just saying, well, you've got a budget, now let's try and think of some good solutions. And you can see that really most of the resources that really come to play come from the hearts and the minds of the people involved, people whose lives it was. And our job is to facilitate that. Okay, I think that's enough speech. So I think it's whether we want some more questions and whether we want to facilitate that in any different way. Do anybody got any other questions they want to ask? Arnie, Petri? You had some questions that people have asked via Twitter or other means, and so has anybody got any questions? Or no, maybe not questions, maybe you want to disagree, challenge what I've said. Said disagree and haven't shot up.
I'm Annika from the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health. I don't disagree with you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I haven't heard you before, but I need to get myself informed about personal budgets. And obviously, as an official in the ministry, I'm interested in the risks. There must be some risks, and especially how do you guarantee that the disabled person gets to choose what he wants or she wants, and not, for example, the parents. There must be some risks in that area that you still get make the puzzles during the day, you know, instead in the institution maybe you do it at home, or the parents decide what they want to do and then you do what they want you to do. And another question is relating to this. Not everyone has family and friends, and is there any risk that, how should I put it, you kind of put the responsibility of the services for the family and friends, and the states or municipalities kind of wash their hands on it then?
Yes. Yes. Two very good questions, and actually both very relevant. So, in a way, I think that certainly the approach we took in England was to say that the fundamental security in the system, with regard to the risk that you're talking about in the first question, is still the social work system. So we didn't change that in a sense. That was the foundation. So the social worker's job before personal budgets and after personal budgets was still to make sure people were okay. What we stressed was fundamentally your job is not to, as it were, go and design a service for Arnie, but was to go and work out two fundamental things. And I haven't stressed perhaps the second thing enough. One is how big the budget should be. The second is, how does Arnie make decisions for himself? So what we sometimes call in England supported decision making. We wrote some principles around this, and we have some pretty good legislation, but the practice is as variable as you'd expect. I think the practice is as variable before personal budgets as after personal budgets. I suppose the thing is that I don't feel too bad about that, is that we've not made anything worse, but if you said, have we sorted out the problem of perfectly guaranteeing that people with cognitive impairments are always getting the right decision maker? No. Have we improved the situation? Yes. Because we've improved the situation because we've made it possible to actually come up with different representatives, and we've made it possible for social workers to facilitate that. And so what you've actually seen is lots of good opportunities for people, and families are the number one, I've got to say. It's not the only, but it is the number one example of where, because while the worry you have is true, the opposite truth is that families are the best guarantee of the safety and security of most of us. It isn't professionals that are the best guarantee. There's no data to suggest that. So if you create a system which actually pushes families out, that's the dangerous thing to do. But you're right, it's an issue where I still think that social workers have a fundamental responsibility, and I would say that in England the system hasn't got worse, but it hasn't got dramatically better. Opportunities for it to get better have improved, but that's slightly different, isn't it? So I think it's a really important thing to be thinking about, but I think you have to avoid the mistake of thinking that that's a new problem. That problem existed in the institutional system. Yeah, so now the second point is also very, very important. And I think in England, actually, more than the first one, in England we've got the second one wrong. And we've got it wrong because we have not, it really goes back to the data. And if I go right back, and I think that, oh, it's up here, yeah. Now, again, I don't know if I could prove this to you, but I'm not quite sure what the proof would look like. I have to think about it a bit more. But this is very suspicious to me. Okay, so direct payments is people directly controlling the money, and the way direct payments works still in England is too bureaucratic, so it does create unnecessary burdens. The reason why those numbers are now so high is because many families are now able to take direct payments that they couldn't before personal budgets. And I know that families are being burdened with unnecessary bureaucracy on the one hand, and also then you see them in those data, there is no personal budgets managed by others, which is the natural thing families want and need. They want the freedom to choose who manages and the flexibility to take that out. And actually, I went around recently, I wrote some guidance for the English Department of Health on this version 2 and why, kind of trying to create opportunities for this version 2 managed personal budget. And I went and asked local authorities, why don't you allow community organisations and service providers to manage budgets for people? Why do you put the burden on people with disabilities, and why do you put the burden on families when they don't always want it? And they said, we don't trust the service providers. And I said, but you've given them all the money. You see the paradox? So we have this system, and this has been driven by 25 years of purchase, providing, commissioning, procurement practices. We have a culture of mistrust now. So if you're in a municipality or a social worker, your view is that providers are not to be trusted. You still spend money on them. It's strange, isn't it? The system basically, that's its only way of doing anything, but you've created a culture where you don't trust the natural organisations to provide the services. So that's a disaster that we didn't have to, I think it's a real failing in England. We've got plenty of good small-scale examples of version 2 models working, but not enough to even get into the Department of Health's own statistics. And I think, yeah, I would, if I was in Finland, that's something I'd try and get right from the beginning. And for reasons to do with our history and the development of these approaches, we've really struggled. And when I go back to England, that's probably the major thing I'll be involved in, is trying to get that stuff going again. Yeah, good questions. Thank you. Any other? And challenges also are absolutely fine. Thoughts?
I have an idea and a question from this picture. Did I understand correctly that nursing care and residential care are not part of personal budgets in England? And if not, how come is it impossible to change nursing care and group residential care into personal budgets?
I am no longer party to the discussions that go on inside the Department of Health, so I can't be sure. When we were developing personal budgets, one of the big outcomes was people left residential care with their personal budgets. So people exercised the freedom to leave. I suspect that what's happened is that lobbyists from registered care and nursing care providers have put pressure on the Department of Health. We recently had a big nursing care home failure. We've had private companies come in and develop nursing care, buy up lots of nursing care homes and borrow lots of money to do it, assuming that the housing market would go up. After 2008 and the economic disaster, that model fell over. And one of the things that actually none of those people paid attention to was that when people have personal budgets, they don't tend to choose registered care. So I would say there's no reason why you would exclude that option, but the registered care market has fought to exclude it, so that when people go into that sector, almost they don't need to get involved in the money, and that they don't therefore necessarily aware of their right to stop doing that. I think that's what's happened. So that is going to be another of the things that will be up for battle in England. Any other questions?
Fun last.
Yeah.
Okay, Elina Sani Olligainen here again, FDUV. I wanted to ask you about good examples with NGOs managing the budgets. Would you have some good examples of good partnerships we could form, for example?
Yes, yeah. Well, I suppose the examples that I gave, this organisation that created in 1996, Inclusion Glasgow.
Sorry, what is MGO?
Non-governmental organisation, charity. Yeah, so this one example is kind of things like this. So this was just, yes, an organisation that's really wanting to provide flexible, personalised support. So, and we created a small community-based organisation to do that. That was almost built into the DNA. The other example recently in England is an organisation called Choice Support, and they're quite a traditional, well, in English standards, they provide generally small group home services, supported living services, average care home, they're not care homes, but average size home, group home would be 3 or 4 people. So a bit smaller than the Finnish average. But they large organisation. Now they started breaking down their contracts, changing their financial systems, changing their planning. Again, they did that themselves. There's also really interesting examples of, just a little example, a community organisation in Wigan, where one lady was getting services from, she had a learning disability and was getting services from the adult social services for herself, and then her children were getting children's social services organised by Children's Social Services. Complete mess, because even though both were run by the municipality, they were organised completely differently. Yes, so they didn't actually cooperate around the family. And in this case, a small charity just said, well, you give us, both put money in, and we'll figure that out with the woman herself. So we've also seen kind of brokerage organisations do the same, and peer support organisations. Again, as I say, it's a kind of that scale though. Do you know what I mean? I think it's a bit of a shame that it is at that scale, because 10 years into personal budgets we could be a lot further forward. I don't think it's terribly technically difficult. It's really just common sense stuff. It's a bit like, this is like good social work. It's saying, right, this is your budget, let's come up with some solutions. But, and it goes to the heart of the earlier question, you're not saying you have to employ all the staff, or you take on the responsibilities you want to take on, you feel comfortable taking on, and yet you can use your budget also to have other people take on responsibilities. So there are models, but it's still pretty low level. Other questions? Any other questions? Warn you out. The English-speaking moral philosophers warn you out at 10 to 4.
Well, there was one, I think, from social media, and one that often comes up is, and you touched a bit on the issues, countryside versus bigger cities.
Yes.
So, are there more choices in bigger cities? What happens in the countryside? And it's a question that really is for Finland, since we're all the time seeing that's all the very basic service posts and even health centrals are kind of diminishing from smaller villages, and while we're having this a big reform of social and healthcare and transforming 300 municipalities to 15 social and health areas or something like this, we always may think that what happens to local services, are they suddenly disappearing? So what's your views on this?
I mean, I'm going to start at the wrong end and say, if there was one thing I pray that you do in Finland, it's that if you do introduce personal budgets, it's that you start with a focus on community. I have great admiration for what the Australians are doing, but what they've done is also centralise the whole system, and they've made it completely detached from local communities. So I know what's going to happen, because it happened in England when we introduced the Independent Living Fund. Some areas get really good at claiming the budgets. And if the more, as it were, it goes back to the question, the more bureaucratic and the further away you are, yes, then it takes more organisation to kind of demand it, and once you get it, you get good at getting it. And then you'll have other parts of Finland where that doesn't happen. So if I was creating a personal budget system for Finland, to be honest, I'd take a population map for Finland and make sure the money was kind of mapped against the real populations and the communities, so that you avoid the slippage which you'll otherwise see of further money leaving your country to your towns. Now, personal budgets won't necessarily make that problem better or worse, but you could design into a system of personal budgets a way of protecting the country. That would be my thing. If I was a Finn, if I was in the Finnish government, that's what I'd, because that you will, I mean, it's just inevitable, and if you move to these, well, you're going to move to these regions, you're going to see resources move to cities and towns. It just happens. It's all over the world. You centralise power, and services follow the centralisation of power. But you could design a personal budget system that actually compensated for that. So I would do that. In practice, we did not see any problem spending money in the country. And in a way, if you put that way, you can see why there would be no problem. Okay, if I say, right, Petteri, let's imagine, Petteri, you're living in Lapland, okay, and here's 10,000 euros. Is Petteri not going to find a solution in Lapland with 10,000 euros? Of course he's going to find a solution. It isn't going to be buying daycare from a daycare provider in Helsinki or even in Rovaniemi, or yes, because he'll figure out with family and friends how to keep that money local, meeting his needs where he wants to live. And that's what people do. So, but what you do see is the more rural, the more creative you have to be, because nobody's offering you a standard solution. But you can link that, and that's in a way that, so we saw, like we have, it's nothing like Lapland, but Lincolnshire and Cumbria are two big areas, and they were some of the leading areas for the development of personal budgets. And one example from Lincolnshire I quite like is that we have a service called Meals on Wheels. You have things like that, where so there would be somewhere in Lincoln, which is a city in Lincolnshire, where they would cook meals, and they would put them in a little van, and then they would drive this many miles to an older person's home and say, here's your meal, and maybe, I don't think it'd be hot then, it'd have to be microwaved or reheated. That's not good on lots of counts, is it? With a personal budget, what people started to do was take their personal budget, not buy the Meals on Wheels service, but go to the local pubby. That's another Finnish word. That house and pubby. That's a bit sad as my two Finnish words for the day. But actually say, could you cook me a meal? Could you make sure I get it? Pubs would start to actually make sure people came to the pub to get the meal. We have, again, like you, similar problems, not as extreme, but money heading out of rural locations, pubs closing. Actually, things like this are really good for the local economy. So I would say personal budget helps solve that problem, but you could be really clever and build it into the design of your personal budget system to kind of attach the money to localities, which also allows you a way of managing risk in a more sensible way. Because a typical municipality, it may seem too small for thinking about ambulance services or something like that, but it's not too small for thinking about the distribution of a set of personal budgets. So you could keep some of your thinking at a municipality level, even if you took some of the systems away. I would hope that you do. Okay. Well, should we give people a 5-minute bonus to finish off early? Like, unless you're extra. And well done for sticking with it this long. Do you want to say anything else to just finish?
Yeah, close. Kiitos oikein paljon tästä päivästä. Meidän nämä esitykset on siis videoitu ja ne tulee tullut tänään YouTubesta ja ne tulee meidän palvelusäätiön nettisivuille kvps.fi. Sieltä kautta ainakin löytyy jo varmasti jotenkin tästä sitten viestiä. Samoin nämä päiväesitykset on sieltä ladattavissa. Todennäköisesti oikein hyvä päivä. Kaikki nämä meidän seminaarit on ollut oikein hyviä. Meillä oli oikein hyviä kysymyksiä, oikein hyvää keskustelua ja vähän sitä, mistä tänä päivä alkoi, oli se, että tätä valinnanvapautta näissä sote-palveluissa halutaan lisätä. Poliitikot haluaa lisätä. Ja tällä hetkellä on käynnissä tämmöinen iso muutos, iso myllerys tässä koko meidän sote-kentässä. Ja katsotaan nyt, miten tämä valinnanvapaustyöryhmä jättää sitten lopullisen raporttinsa sitten parin kuukauden kuluttua, niin puhutaanko siinä ollenkaan samanlaisista asioista, mitä tänään puhuttiin. Mun mielestä me puhuimme tänään täysin valinnanvapaudesta, joustavista ratkaisusta, mitkä pitäisi ehdottomasti ottaa huomioon, kun rakennetaan meidän sote-palveluita. Jos ei tällä ole enää mitään käsittävää, niin paljon kiitoksia meidän puolesta. Kiitos THL:lle oikein hyvistä puitteista ja tiloista ja kiitos, että olette mukana. Kiitos paljon.